Thank you, everybody, for coming to my presentation. My name is Renellys Perez. Today, I'll be showing you an analysis of a 10-year data set of the deep western boundary current volume transport at 34.5 South in the South Atlantic. This work is being carried out in collaboration. What was that? I'll just keep going. This work is being carried out in collaboration with a team of scientists that are listed below and will probably grow to include others as the narrative develops. Much of the data that I'll be presenting comes from the NOAA-funded Southwest Atlantic MOC, or SAM project. SAM consists of 4 moorings in the Southwest Atlantic, which you see in that graphic there, that are labeled sites A to D, and they're used to monitor changes in the western boundary currents and water mass properties. Today, I'm going to focus on the Deep Western Boundary Current, or DWBC, which flows southward along the western boundary, and it flows underneath the southward flowing near-surface Brazil Current. Together with the other arrays, SAM pies are used to estimate the strength of the meridional overturning circulation, or MOC, at 34.5 South, and that's part of the SAMBA array effort. So it's a couple of arrays that are put together to estimate the strength of the overturning circulation. We can also compare with what is observed by other arrays to examine the connectivity of the circulation systems. So why do we study the Deep Western Boundary Current? So we study them because the Deep Western Boundary Current and the properties of the waters that are found within the Deep Western Boundary Current are formed at high latitudes, and we want to detect and understand any climate variations that we observe. We also want to observe the MOC. I don't have to say that to this audience that's listening here because we have a lot of people who are MOC experts, but that's what's being shown by the idealist schematic on the right. We want to study that because it can impact things we care about, weather and climate conditions regionally and globally. SAM itself consists of 4 pressure-equipped inverted echo sounders, which is shown in the picture on the bottom right, which you can see. And those are in the upper right panel, there's the map of where the moorings are located, and the SAM sites are labeled A through D. And we've been collecting observations at those sites since 2009. And our last cruise was in the middle of 2019. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we haven't had a chance to collect data since then. On the western boundary, there are also annual hydrographic cruises. So CTD and LADCP measurements are collected during those cruises that are led by our Argentine partners, which permit data collection and servicing of the pies. And they're hoping that in 2022, they will deploy 2 tall moorings as part of a collaborative EU Horizon 2020 project. We also have Brazilian partners that also do annual hydrographic cruises. So together, we have 2 cruises a year, and that allows another opportunity to do hydrography and maintain the multiple pies at sites that are on the western boundary. The Brazilians also have additional pie sites and moorings that are interspersed with the SAM pies. And 2 of the sites, which are labeled AA and BB, which you can see in the map in the upper right corner, those were operational for part of the time period that I'm analyzing and presenting today. And again, we haven't had cruises since 2019, and we hope to have 2 cruises in 2022 to recover and redeploy the pies. So if you're not familiar with a pies measures 2 key things directly. It measures the round-trip acoustic travel time for a sound pulse to travel up to the sea surface, reflect, and return. And because the speed of the sound in seawater is dependent on the temperature and salinity of the water, travel time tells us something about the temperature and salinity structure of the water on top of the pies. So the pies is just moored at the seafloor, and it's just sending that pulse up to the surface and listening for that pulse to return. A pies also directly measures bottom pressure near the seafloor. And to make that measurement, there is also internal to the pies sphere a temperature sensor. And we've just recently started using those measurements to study bottom temperature variations. So what does pies tell you indirectly? When you have a lot of hydrographic data in the region and you can build these empirical relationships, we call them fields, and they basically provide you with a lookup table. If you know the travel time, you can look and see what the water, you can infer what the temperature and salinity profile must be at the mooring. And so from that, you can generate a full depth time series of dynamic height at each pie site. And when you have 2 adjacent pies, you can estimate between the pies the baroclinic or density driven geostrophic velocity across the segment. So if you have a line of sensors going from west to east, you can estimate the north-south geostrophic velocity across each pair of moorings. You can similarly difference the pressure measurements between adjacent pies to estimate the barotropic or pressure-driven geostrophic velocity. And that's just giving you the variability. So both of those things are giving you the variability, and you can add them together to get the total geostrophic velocity variability. And then we need to use ancillary measurements. So if you have a lot of cruise sections, or if you don't, you can use a numerical model, and we use a numerical model to just provide a reference mean, a time mean, to reference the geostrophic velocity to a level of known motion. So again, all of the variability is coming from the observations. Some of the information of the mean is coming from a model, but you could easily replace that with ancillary observations if that's what you have a lot of. So here are the moorings that we have data from in 2009 to 2019. Two of them, Sandbar AA and Sandbar BB, are the Brazilian moorings, and you can see that we have the least data at those sites. And then the other four are the SAM moorings. And what you can see from looking at this time, these are travel time that have been 30-day low pass filtered. What you can see from these records is that the ocean's a challenging environment, and sustaining a long-term array is not easy. And if we required ourselves to only be able to estimate what's happening when we have all of the sites available, we would be limiting ourselves to a shorter period of time, and we'd have a gappy data set. So we want to do the best we can to weave together all of the available data that we have to generate a continuous time series. Okay, so that's the goal for this presentation. I'm going to build a 10-year deep western boundary current transport time series that is free from gaps and uses as many of the observations as I can to make my estimate. This will be an update of the calculation that was published by Chris Minen in 2017, which is shown on the right. And then we're going to use the data set, this extended data set that has 10 years of information and no gaps, to characterize the temporal variability of the deep western boundary current. In that previous study that was shown on the slide before, the flow is integrated from site A to site D, so that's the box in the bottom region. And what you can see, and also from 800 decibars down to 4,800 decibars. And what you can see is that so blue is southward flow, and red and yellow is northward flow. And you can see that integrating over that domain, you're including a large recirculation of the deep western boundary current in that integration. So this is the deep western boundary current core here, and this is a recirculating mean flow. And what the three panels are showing you here, just in case you're curious, the top panel is using only the SAM pi site, so 4 moorings, to estimate the mean flow, and using the full 10-year record. The middle panel is if I just use the time period for which I have 6 moorings between A and D. And the bottom right panel is showing you the same time period, the same 4-year time period, but when I include the moorings from the Brazilian sites, include the information from the Brazilian sites so that I can have the best resolved structure of the mean flow. So you're just stepping you through the comparisons of what information you have when you only have 4 sites versus what information you have possible when you have 6 sites. So again, integrating over to site D is including a lot of this recirculation. What would be great is to only integrate to the Brazilian site BB, but as I showed you from the time series, we don't always have data from that site. That site is close to the zero mean velocity contour. So if we had a static deep western boundary current that never changed how far offshore it goes, this would be the best domain to integrate offshore to. But in fact, the deep western boundary current pulses and can sometimes extend further offshore. And so we'd miss that by only looking to site BB. So what we do is sort of halfway in between. We integrate to site C, and that allows us to estimate the full deep western boundary current transport and not miss some of the events when the current extends further offshore. We also changed the integration depth slightly because site C is shallower than site D, so we only integrate down to 4,500 decibars for the deep western boundary current time series. In case you're curious about these events when the deep western boundary current is strong versus weak, I'm showing you a composite based on the time when we have 6 moorings, so we can resolve more of the flow structure. And so I took all of the events where the deep western boundary current was 1 sigma one standard deviation above the mean, and I averaged those. And then I took, one standard deviation below the mean, because the deep western boundary current is southward, so the southward flow. And then I took all of the cases where the flow was 1 sigma above the mean, so a weaker deep western boundary current flow, and made 2 composites. And so you can just see that when the recirculation is strong, the deep western boundary current is confined more inshore. And so if we're integrating out to site C, we're capturing some of that recirculation. But on the flip side, when the deep western boundary current is strong and we have a very weak recirculation, we are able to capture this sort of there's 2 cores here of southward flow, and we're able to capture those events by integrating out to site C. So we could potentially integrate just the negative flow between sites A and C, and that's something to think about how to do, but just remember that these images are made from the time when we have 6 moorings, and so it becomes really hard when you get down to only 2 moorings providing data to really do something meaningful like that and exclude northward flow instances when we're estimating the deep western boundary current flow. So I can also take advantage of that time for which we have the 6 mooring sites and compute EOFs for meridional velocity to see what the patterns of variability look like. And so the top panel is the first EOF, the middle panel is the second EOF, the bottom panel is the third EOF, and to the right you have the time series. And I think the one thing I want to draw your eye to is that EOF1 is really the one that's influencing the flow in the deep western boundary current integration domain. And that mode is carrying 33% of the variance. The first mode is mostly barotropic, but that variability is largely offshore. So the deep western boundary current is really inshore of where a lot of this variability is happening. So there's variability associated with the pulsing of the deep western boundary current and it extending further offshore, rather than as much variability in the interior core of the deep western boundary current. The other thing that you'll note is the other 2 EOFs that are not very well separated from one another are really more surface intensified. So they're affecting the upper ocean circulation. So these are probably affecting the MOC more, the upper limb of the MOC. They're affecting the Brazil current. And those are likely evidence of propagating features, since the 2 modes are not very well separated from one another. And again, they're more surface intensified. So getting back to the initial question that I asked when when I was providing the motivation for this talk, is can we construct a long time series despite the gaps? And so what I'm comparing here is the various different configurations we can find ourselves in. So the first one is when we have SAM sites A, B, and C present. So that we're considering that to be our baseline. That's the black line. Then we have a smaller period of time for which we actually have 6 moorings. We have the Brazilian moorings at site AA and BB. And then we have different configurations where we lose site B for a period of time, and that's the blue line. And the green line is when we only have 2 moorings present. We have site A and site C, but those 2 records were continuous throughout the whole 10 years. And so we don't want to lose that information just because we lose some of the interior moorings between the 2. So just stepping through these figures, these different curves, you see that they're very similar to one another. And all of these configurations, if I'm comparing to the baseline A to C calculation, only alter the mean between about 2.3 to 4.5 Sverdrup. So it's not really introducing much of a change to the mean flow during the time period of overlap, which is southward flow of about 12.5 Sverdrups. And I probably didn't say, but a Sverdrup is 10 to the 6 meters cubed per second, in case you're not familiar with that unit. So what's happening here, it's changing the mean a little bit, possibly because which sensors you have introduces a little bit of a bias, but also because the time period is changing. So I probably need to redo this calculation, just focus in on the same time period for every time that I'm estimating the mean difference, so that I can hone in on what is the bias that's introduced by changing sensors and what is actually changing because I have a longer time series available. But the point is that if you can't really see the difference between the lines, they're plotting like nearly on top of each other, and it's just introducing small changes to the variability. And to further illustrate that, I've added the correlations. You can see that that when we have 6 sites, it's very well correlated to what happens when we have only the SAM sites. When we lose site B, it's still very well correlated. When we only have sites A and C available, it's still very well correlated with the baseline measurements of when we have sites A, B, and C. So any of these would be really good to use to estimate the flow. And what I do is I go through and I just, always take the best available estimate and construct a 10-year record using the best available, and that's what the purple line is on the bottom. So it's very well correlated with the baseline measurement, and we always use whatever is the best, and then step to the next choice, and then step to the next choice. So now that we have this 10-year best available time series, we can examine its properties. So the mean transport for the deep western boundary current is 16.3 Sverdrups southward, and the standard deviation is 21.6 Sverdrups, which exceeds the mean. So it's more variable than its mean. And that variability is on very short time scales, as you can just visually see from looking at the time series. There is a negative trend that's tending to increase the deep western boundary current transport. It's about 1.2 Sverdrups per decade, but at this time it's not a significant trend. So given the large, high frequency variability that's in the time series, that's not an emerging trend that's significant. I think that's all I want to say about that. So thinking about our motivation, one of the questions that we were interested in is whether the deep western boundary current variability mirrors the near bottom temperature variations that are observed as the pi sites. As I said at the beginning, the pies have this internal temperature sensor that we've started to use for science. And I'm showing you an image from a paper published 2 years ago, Minen et al. 2020, that's showing the bottom temperature record at each of these pi sites. So site A, B, C, D. And the thing that's really intriguing about these sites is you can see a lot of high frequency variability at the inshore sites, but at sites C and D, which are very deep, they're 4,500 meters and 4,700 meters, you see this emerging long-term trend that's present in the time series. So the natural question to ask ourselves is this at all related to the deep western boundary current transport? So now that we have this 10-year record of temperature and we have a 10-year record of deep western boundary current transport, we can look at that. And so I know this is not everybody's favorite way of looking at spectra, but I wanted to compare with the published values that were reported this way. And so this is the Welch's average period autogram method, and this is spectra in the variance preserving format using a 2-year window and allowing 1-year period of overlap. And what it's showing you visually is that you have a lot of high frequency energy. You didn't need to look at the spectra to see that. You can look at the time series to see that. If you don't like looking at spectra in this way, if I filter the time series and high pass filter and only look at the high frequency variability above 220 days, 75% of the variance is contained in those high frequency variations. So the short time scale variability is really dominating the signal in the deep western boundary current transport. Okay, so comparing to the spectra that were published in Minen et al. 2020, you do see that there's a hint that there might be some covariability between the deep western boundary current and some of the bottom temperature measurements at the SAM sites, because there is some energy, some high frequency variation in those 20 to 220 day windows. But there's a lot of variability that is really shorter than that, and there's variability that's long term that is not being captured in the deep western boundary current transport time series. We don't have a long-term trend in that time series, and there's a long-term trend in the bottom temperature records. You can do a quick lagged autocorrelation analysis, and that you can just tell, the only thing you have to look at is that the scale doesn't go to 1. So there's not a strong correlation between the deep western boundary current and the temperatures at each of those pi sites. The only site that has a modest correlation that is maybe significant is site B, and that is a lagged correlation. It's not a zero lag correlation. So it's peaking when the deep western boundary current leads bottom temperature variations by 21 days. So this means that when you have a positive deep western boundary current anomaly, which weakens the southward flow, that corresponds to a warming of bottom temperature at site B. The fact that site A has a weak 0 lag correlation and site B has a lagged correlation, may possibly be associated with propagating features, westward propagating features. So this is offshore, this is inshore, and so there might be a propagating element to why you have some correlation at these timescales. Again, these are really weak correlations. I don't want to make too much out of them, but this is something that we plan to continue to look at as we have longer and longer time series to see if, when you consider all time scales, is there correlation? When you focus on longer time scales, do we find an emerging co-relationship between the deep western boundary current and the bottom temperature? We can do the very same thing with the MOC time series that's estimated from the Samba array. So if I take the time series that just uses SAM site A and the French most inshore site, French South Africa most inshore site, which is site Z, and compare the MOC to the deep western boundary current transport, there's a very small correlation. It's like 0.3 at 0 lag and at 134 days. So this means that if for the 0 lag, what this means is that a positive transport anomaly, a reduction in the deep western boundary current strength, is weakly correlated to an increase in the strength in the northward flowing MOC, which makes sense because the Brazil current and the deep western boundary current have the same sign, and sometimes they vary in phase with one another. But as you remember from the EOFs I showed, the second and the third mode of the EOF is really surface intensified and it's not affecting the deep western boundary current. So it's not surprising that this correlation isn't very strong, because there's sometimes when they're varying in phase and sometimes when the Brazil current and the deep western boundary current are not varying in phase. So I would imagine the upper and lower circulations are sometimes not significantly related to one another. So again, these figures are still pretty preliminary, and I'm in the process of extending the MOC time series through June 2019, so we would have 2 more years of data to compare against. And hopefully we'll have a cruise in 2022 where we'll be able to extend the time series through 2022. We can also do the same thing. Marion Kersale did use 9 of the Samba sites to estimate the MOC and the abyssal circulation, and that's the blue curve is the abyssal circulation. And surprisingly, there's some correlation between the deep western boundary current and the abyssal circulation. Again, not super strong. This is only based on 4 years of data, but it's just one of the things that we're just going to keep tabs on as we start accumulating longer and longer data sets to see if there's covariability between what's happening under the MOC. There's another circulation cell that involves the North Atlantic deep water and the Antarctic bottom water. And so that's what this blue line is associated with. Okay, so there's not much going on connecting the deep western boundary current transport to the trans-basins activity that's happening, but we can look at what's happening locally. And what I can do is decompose the deep western boundary current transport into, so that's the black line on the bottom. I can decompose it into the pressure-driven component or the barotropic component, called the reference layer in the publications that we've had come out in the past years. And I can also look at the baroclinic component, which is the relative contribution. And what you see, visually is that there's a very strong correlation between the net absolute transport and the barotropic component. So that's telling you that the pressure-driven variations are really what's driving a lot of the variability in the deep western boundary current at this location. And the correlation between the red and the black curve is 0.9. The trend that we do detect in the deep western boundary current, even though it's not significant, the term that it's coming from is the pressure-driven term. It's not coming from the density-driven term, the baroclinic term. So when we have a multi-year time series, the first thing we like to do is see if there's an annual cycle. Not that we expect there to be a strong annual cycle. Other analyses at other locations have shown that if there is an annual cycle, it's not very strong. But it's one of the things that you do when you have a 10-year record. And so we overlay all of the deep western boundary current transports for all the years according to their calendar day, and then we average to estimate the seasonal cycle. And so the thick line is the mean of all of those gray curves, and the shading is the 1 sigma standard error about that mean. And similar to other estimates of the seasonal cycle of the deep western boundary current, it's not that strong. Here, there's a hint of a semi-annual cycle. And if I expanded these error bars to include 2 sigma, which would tell you if it was significant with 95% confidence, even less of the points are significant. So it will be interesting to look as we accumulate longer term observations to say for certain whether there's a significant seasonal cycle, but there is one. It's semi-annual. It may not be significant yet. Looking at longer time scales, we can average all of the data that we have each year and basically make this time series of the mean deep western boundary current transport every year. The blue line is showing you the mean transport only using, sorry, I inverted that. The blue line shows you the time series for the best available. So if I have 6 moorings, I use 6 moorings. If I have 2, I use 2. The red line is showing you the same thing, but only using sites A and C. So it's the inferior version of the time series. What you can see looking at the blue line, which is whatever I have, the best available, it's showing you that the mean transports can range from -2 SVERJUPs to -29 SVERJUPs with large year-to-year differences. These year-to-year variations are still present when we only use sites A and C. So it's not because we're introducing more observations or less observations, or it's not only because. It's still present when we have a stable configuration in terms of the number of moorings we use. There really is this interannual variability in the signal. What is driving this? That's a very good question. Something that we're going to start looking at as we build longer time series of the MOC. There is some suggestion of like a 0.7 correlation between the MOC and deep western boundary current on these annual and longer time series. So what I showed you earlier that showed very weak correlation was when all time periods were considered. When you just focus on annual and longer timescales, there may be more connection between the MOC and the deep western boundary current strength. But again, that's a very short record. We only have 6 years of data, so of overlap between the MOC time period and the deep western boundary current time period. So this is something that we'll just keep looking at as we accumulate more data and keep analyzing whether there is a real connection here between the 2 records. One thing that you can look at is, so if I have 1 year of data, I can estimate the record mean. If I have 2 years of data, I can estimate the record mean and keep accumulating to see how long it takes me to stabilize in my mean estimate. And so what you see is that by the time you have 4 years of data, you get an approximately consistent value in what the mean strength of the deep western boundary current is, and it levels off. So adding 1 more year of data isn't going to really change the mean value. You can do the same thing. You can look at the annual standard deviations. So this figure here is taking all of the data in 1 year and computing the mean. This panel is showing you what happens if you look at the variability each year. And what you see is that there's a tremendous amount of variability. So in this year, the variability was almost half what it was in 2015. And the red curve again is showing you what happens when you only have sites A and C. And the blue curve is showing you what happens when you have the best available estimates. So the takeaways from this is when you have more moorings, you do reduce the transport variability. So you have an overestimate of the transport variability when you only have 2 sites. And the other thing is that there's this peak in 2015 that I'm going to come back to in a couple of slides, that it's a year that you have very high variability, but you have it when that is not a result of having more sensors or less sensors. It's present in both time series. So it's not an artifact of suddenly having 5 sensors or 6 sensors and you're resolving something differently than you did before, because it's still present in the time series that only has 2 sites available. Okay, so I can do the same thing that I did for the means, and I can accumulate my record. So the first dot is the standard deviation of 1 year of data. The second dot is the standard deviation of 2 years of data. And what you can see by the time you get to 10 years, that's when you get sort of a convergence in what the estimate of the record standard deviation is. So that points to the fact, the importance of having a long-term array to look at these kinds of things. If I had stopped, observing 2 years into the record, I would have thought that the variability was much higher than if I stopped 6 years later and then it would be different if I started 10 years later. So there's, just observing for 1 year doesn't tell you the full story of the range of variations that are out there. And you only get that information when you're out there for a much longer period of time. Okay, so what happened in 2015? It's a time period for which you have a very strong positive swing in the transport anomalies. So this is weakening the deep western boundary current, followed by a very strong negative anomaly in the transport, which is serving to intensify the deep western boundary current. And so this is happening in the course of 3 months. So from April 2015 to mid-June 2015. And if I look at the anomalies so I subtract out the mean, I can look at the velocity anomalies as those signals are moving across the array. And what you see is this positive in the upper left panel, you have a positive velocity anomaly that is making its way as you step through the figures. It's making its way towards the shore across the array. And so that is the anomaly that you see in spring that's causing that strong peak. And then if you look at the next anomaly that comes through, you see there's a negative anomaly, so a negative velocity anomaly that's propagating westward across the moorings. So it's moving westward steadily across the moorings in the summer of 2015. And a quick ballpark estimate of those speeds estimates a speed of about 1 to 2 centimeters per second of those anomalies moving across, which is a little slower than the observed values reported in Shelton and Schlack's 1996 for the first mode baroclinic Rossby waves. That's about 4 centimeters per second. So I have some ideas of how to look at this using other ancillary data sets, but I'm happy to talk about that with people afterwards when folks are asking questions on ideas for how to get at what I should anticipate seeing based on theory and observations in terms of first mode baroclinic Rossby waves at this location. So with that, I will wrap up. I really appreciate everybody listening to my presentation. This is still work in progress, so I really welcome feedback from everybody. I'll summarize what we've learned so far. We generated a 10-year continuous deep western boundary current transport time series at 34.5 south. From that data, we were able to examine the variability, which is mostly high frequency and barotropic or pressure driven. Even though the deep western boundary current is strongly related to the pressure changes, the bottom pressure changes, it's barotropic, there's only a weak correlation with the bottom temperature variations at the SAM sites. And we'll have to look at this in more detail as we accumulate more data to see what if anything, is the correlationship between the deep western boundary current and the bottom temperatures, especially at site B, which is the one site I didn't say, the one site which is at 3,500 meters depth, which is in the depth range that I'm integrating to estimate my deep western boundary current transport. We found large year-to-year variations in the deep western boundary current, which are mirrored by year-to-year changes in the MOC. Because of these variations, it takes 4 years to get a stable mean estimate of the deep western boundary current and 10 years to get a fairly stable estimate of the standard deviation. And again, this points to the value of having a long-term array. So future work will be to examine in more detail the variability that we're observing and analyze it more in the context of other data sets and numerical models. So I have some ideas of how to do that, but I welcome, in the chat that we have afterwards, your ideas on that topic. We'd also like to compare to the deep western boundary current that's been observed at other locations. And I'm just showing a couple of examples in this slide where the means and standard deviations and for significant chunks of time of observations of deep western boundary current transport have been made. And so we'd like to compare with what's happening upstream of our mooring. So looking at the North Atlantic, looking at 11 South, and seeing how that compares with what we observed. So one example, the one that's most upstream, that's closest to our array and just upstream of our array, is Geomar maintains a moored array at 11 South, which has current meters and bottom pressure recorders. And it's now has a fairly long time series. It was first instrumented in 2000 to 2004. They redeployed in 2013 and it's still in the water now. And so with this data, we have the ability to compare with what they're observing further upstream of us. So I'd like to thank everybody for their attention, and I want to thank NOAA GOMO and NOAA AML for their support of the SAM project. Thank you to our Argentinian and Brazilian partners, without whom we couldn't collect SAM measurements. And any MOC results that I presented were through our collaborations with our French and South African colleagues. And lastly, I want to just recognize that a lot of effort goes into collecting this data in the field, processing this data, getting instruments shipped, batteries replenished, cruises to happen. So I just want to extend the thanks to everybody in our lab that is responsible for that. And with that, I'll stop and take questions.